and smarter testing through smarter testers. I'm very open to having a dialogue, so if you have comments, feedback, questions, feel free to interrupt nicely anytime. The fact that I have the microphone doesn't mean that my opinions are any more valuable or interesting than any of your opinions and your comments. And the way I like to develop ideas is by first I think about it myself, then I talk about it with my colleagues, and then I like to go and present it somewhere to get more feedback and more responses. Then I go back and I think about it some more, and improve it over time. So this is actually my chance to work on my ideas and make them better. So I really appreciate that you're giving me the chance to do that today. My name is Christin Wiedemann, by the way. I'm the chief scientist at PQA Testing. That's a local testing services company. My background is in astroparticle physics. That's why I get to call myself the chief scientist. Wow. I spent 11 years in the academic world, which is slightly different than working in the industry. I worked in all different countries, and I've been and worked at South Pole in Antarctica, which is by far the most extreme work environment, but also one of the nicest and most pleasant ones I've ever been in. And one of the few places where I've actually never really been cold. So, why talk about smarter testing? Do we need to get smarter? Are we already smart enough?
Never.
We are smart enough and never. I definitely think we are smart in general. But there's always room for improvement, right? We can always get a little bit better. And I'm going to try to explain why I want to talk about smart and being smarter today. What does smart mean, though? We already discovered a couple of times today that we use words very differently, and we mean very different things with the same word, and we mean the same thing using different words. So the dictionary defines smart as having or showing quick-witted intelligence. Some of the synonyms are clever, bright, intelligent, sharp-witted, shrewd, astute, and able. And what stands out to me in this is the quick, astute, and able. So to me, smart testing means being quick to understand and assess the context, to be able to analyze the environment in which we're in, and to find a solution that fits to that particular context. So to some extent, I associate smart with being lean. To be able to solve a problem without creating unnecessary overhead and waste. And I also think of smart as being able to take advantage of the resources that we have and making the most of it. Because sometimes we look at the given set of resources and we don't start until we have X, Y, and Z. I think we can always make progress. No matter how little or how much we have, there's always something we can do and always some way in which we can add value. And especially in agile environments, we don't always have everything we could possibly have to do our job, right? But there's always something we can still contribute. I believe in being proactive rather than sitting passively and waiting. And I also think it's a human desire to want to improve. I think it's just in our nature that we always want to do better, make progress, and evolve. We just need to encourage it a little bit. And if you just look around at conference presentations, books, articles, blogs, they're all trying to pitch a way in which we can improve, right? Have you ever seen a sales pitch for a tool that doesn't tell you it's going to help you test better? That's what we're trying to do all the time, right? So how can agile testing improve? So there's a lot of discussion still around what testing on an agile project means. And we talked quite a bit today about, do testers need to be able to code? Is agile testing just automation? Is there room for manual testing? And there's a lot of diverse opinions on what agile on a testing project really means, and what the tester role is and what it should be. When we talk about agile testing, though, and how to advance it, we often end up talking about tools, I find. There's a lot of talk about unit tests versus automated unit tests versus integration tests versus UI tests? Should you use Selenium? Should you use UFT? And it's a bit of a jungle because there's a lot of tools out there. How many have I missed? And it just keeps growing, right? There are more and more open source tools, but there are also more and more commercial tools, and the market is continuously changing. And I very strongly believe that tools should support the process that you have rather than enforcing a specific process for that tool. And I also think that the true limitation of most tools lies, of course, in how we implement and use them, not in the tools themselves. How many have been in an environment where you buy a new tool because it's going to solve all your problems? How many are originally maybe done Agile because that's going to solve all your problems? Did it work?
New problems.
You create new problems. So tools, I'm pretty sure if you look up what tool actually means, it's supposed to help and support you, right? But it's not a solution in itself. And I believe that there is one master tool, the one essential tool that we don't talk often enough about. What could I possibly be talking about? And Elena, who's in the front row at the front table, said this morning. My brain is my most important tool. Thank you. I did ask if I would have.
Famous.
You're going to be famous. It's going to be all over the internet. If you all spread it and make sure to quote her and give her credit. It was very appropriate, though, because I completely agree with you. And we all do, right? It's our minds or our brains that are really the most powerful tools we have. And we don't always use them to the full potential. And I think sometimes we let focus drift away too much and talking about the technologies. So methodologies, processes, and technical tools, they can really be of great help. But we are still relying on our minds. And we need to get better at acknowledging that and talk more about it. And talk about how do we evolve that part. So basically, how do we get smarter about it? So what does smarter testing mean to you? If it means nothing, then we're done. Can all go home. It's perfect. What does smarter testing mean?
It means you use the resources available and do the testing within a reasonable time frame within the budget.
Use the resources you have, do the testing within a reasonable time frame and within budget. Okay, I like that one. Any other?
And possibly along with that, if you see something that can be done better, and if you need to do it better.
If you can do it better, do it better. Yes, because a lot of the time we see things and I don't like how that's done. That's not a good way of doing it. But we don't necessarily contribute better ways to actually change it. So use your resources, and I'm making the life of the poor videographer terrible, sorry. If you see something that can be done better, try to do it better. Okay, other suggestions?
Write better tests.
Write better tests? What do you mean by better tests?
Ones that are smarter, ones that test things that actually matter.
That was a little bit circular, but things that actually matter.
Yeah.
So write better tests that are smarter tests because they test the things that matter. And I did hear risk-driven. I would say risk-based is a good way to do exactly that, right? If you focus on risks, you'll test the things that matter, hopefully. Sorry.
Little too far.
It's like my little parameter, one of those dog collars where you can't go up to the fence. Apparently I'm supposed to stay here. Yes?
When lesson learned, really learned.
Learn from your own mistakes or lessons learned. Have you ever, anyone in here, actually done the same mistake twice on a project or different projects? Why don't we learn from our mistakes? We're stubborn.
Sometimes we don't consider them as mistakes.
We don't always acknowledge them as mistakes, and sometimes I think the problem is, like you said, lessons learned, learn your lessons properly. We don't always take the time to take a step back and think about what we did, what worked, what didn't work, and how can we again improve.
And sometimes we don't know why the mistake occurred. So it happened here, but now it's going to be different.
True, it also changes. We don't always know why something didn't work. And again, we don't always have the time or take the time to go back and think about it. Other ideas about what smarter testing is? Yes, in the way far back.
Less testing, more courage.
Less testing, more courage. I think that's very interesting.
Could you repeat that?
Less testing, more courage.
Ah,
Has anyone ever over-tested something? Why do we do that? Why do we over-test?
Feel comfortable.
Feel comfortable.
Because that's the way it's always been done.
Because that's the way it's always been done, and by all means we can change how things have been done.
Oh, from fear.
Fear. Absolutely. And you said courage, right?
Courage.
I think testing takes a lot of courage.
Courage.
Courage. Sometimes you also hear what you want to hear, which works really well for me. Courage, absolutely. But it does take courage to be able to step back and say, we're covered enough. And it is scary, but what's at stake if we're wrong? Because that's what we're fearing, right? Maybe we're not done. Maybe we haven't covered enough. So what could potentially happen? And if we're risk-driven, and we're sure that we tested the biggest risks first, maybe the fear can go down a little bit. So those are really good suggestions for what smarter testing is. And this is just what to me stands out as the three biggest things. We talked about risk-driven. Absolutely. To me, smarter testing means focusing on the high-risk areas. Sometimes it's really tempting to start by running those simple, easy tests that you also think they're probably just going to pass, but it feels kind of comfortable and I know how to do it, so I'll just start with that. Ever done that? Is that the right way to approach things? Any downsides to that? No downsides, that's awesome.
Complacency.
Sorry?
Complacency.
Complacency, absolutely. Time?
It's a waste of time. I mean, if you're starting with tests that you know are less likely to find defects, you're doing them because they make you feel comfortable.
Well, the little problem with that too is that to really, really feel comfortable and to believe that something works, you have to test everything, right? You have to test every possible scenario under all different conditions. And testing can, of course, never prove that software works. We can only prove ways in which it fails. So if I run one test under a certain specific set of conditions and it passes, that gives me that false sense of comfort, right? But it doesn't really mean anything, and it doesn't really add any information or knowledge. So we need to be a bit daring and starting with those tests that could potentially reveal failures that are high risks. But they're usually more complicated to run. We need to work a little bit harder. But maybe that's the right thing to do, so we're not getting too compliant. I think smart testing also needs to be contextual. So the testing we do should in every aspect be adapted to the specific context we're in. And it should be adapted to the needs of the stakeholders. Who are our stakeholders when we test? Not testing for anyone? Good for you.
Customers.
Customers? That's the only stakeholder?
The team as a whole.
The team is a stakeholder?
Sometimes marketing, sometimes somebody else's
Marketing?
business.
Anyone that would be impacted by the outcome of the project is a stakeholder, right? We all know that, but sometimes still when we think about it, we tend to limit the scope a little bit too much. And I think it's important to make sure that what we do is adapted to what the stakeholders need. Good enough. That's what we talked about, right? Sometimes we should stop testing a little bit earlier. If you have 4 months to test, it doesn't necessarily mean you should test for 4 months. How often have you stopped testing because you run out of time? One person. Absolutely. You give me 4 months, I'm going to use 4 months. No way that I'm giving up a single minute of my test time. But is that really the right thing to do? Rarely. That somehow allowing ourselves to be time boxed that way, we're giving away some of the power we have. The power to say that, okay, I think we're done now, because we've done enough, it's good enough. If you just use up time until someone pulls the plug and releases it into production, that means you're letting someone else make that decision. And sometimes we don't get enough time, absolutely. But it should be a conscious decision that this is what good enough means. I do think that smarter testing requires smart testers. Which of course makes me ask the question, what is a smart tester? Are you smart testers? Of course you are. What makes you smart? I can't read your name tag. And Andrew. Because you're here. Training. This is training, right?
Our state of mind.
State of mind. So what makes your state of mind different? Or what makes you a smart tester?
Because I'm motivated to constant self-education.
Self-education?
Exploring possible ways to test the software.
Exploring ways to test the software is you're expanding your skill set, interested in learning, just like Andrew. The rest of you are here for the free coffee. What else makes a smart tester?
Experience.
Experience?
Exchange of experience.
Exchange, so sharing experience and sharing ideas.
Knowing what you're supposed to test.
Knowing what you're supposed to test. That's an interesting one. What else? If you look at people you work with or your ideal smart tester, what does that mean?
They're open to communication.
Open to communication.
Creativity.
Creativity.
Curiosity?
Critical thinking. I like this.
Doing more with less.
Sorry?
Doing more with less.
Doing more with test.
With less.
With less. So using your resources. Being resourceful.
I want to
Yes.
give an example of a smart tester. It's someone we work with who couldn't join today, but I showed him an application that he had never seen before, and how would we test it, and he just couldn't stop with the idea. The ideas kept coming and coming. Kevin.
An example of a smart tester,
He's
person
very
who just had
smart.
ideas for what to test and just couldn't stop,
Couldn't
basically.
stop, and completely. Only he had just a few features that I was able to describe, and he could go on with ideas of what to test and how to do it.
And I think that ties back to the whole expanding your skill set and learning. Yes, Lisa?
Well, you mentioned your coworker, one of the other testers on my team. I think she's really smart about making the testing efforts visible to the whole team and finding ways to do that so that everybody's aware of what testing needs to be done and is being done, and a lot of times they may be able to help.
Making the test effort visible, so a little bit tied to communication, right? Absolutely. I think testers, to do smart testing, you need to be a smart tester. Again, it means understanding the context, it means being resourceful and using what you have, communicating what you do, being creative, having ideas, critical thinking. Lacking skills means that you lack options. And if you lack options, you tend to be very rigid in your approach. Ever seen that happen on a project? Of course, the more tools you have to choose from, the easier it is to be flexible and adaptable, which tends to be fairly important on any project, but of course, in particular on Agile projects. So, to me, smart testers, first of all, have training and they're interested in training. So self-education, going to conferences, engaging in user groups, blogging, reading blogs, reading articles, reading books. Smart testers have learned and are still learning how to test. They're familiar with a wide range of different technologies and methodologies, so they have that great big toolkit that they can choose from. There's still not a whole lot of university programs, so a lot of test training is through self-education and self-study. I think cognitive skills are also really important. And when I talk about cognitive skills, I mean the ability to process information. So being analytical, being able to employ critical thinking, questioning assumptions, scrutinizing biases, the ability to process visual information too, to observe and recognize patterns in the software. Then we talk about soft skills this morning. And maybe soft skills is not the right word, Lisa and Janet suggested thinking skills. I still associate thinking more with the cognitive skills. When I say soft skills, I think more about relationship skills. I don't have a favorite word. I'm definitely open to a longer discussion about this later. But when I say soft skills, I really mean the ability to build and maintain relationships and to communicate. And I agree with Lisa and Janet that when you talk about soft skills, it kind of implies something that's either really easy to learn or something people just have. Yeah, get good soft skills, born with it. But that also implies that other people can't learn it or get better at it, and I don't think that's the case at all. I think soft skills or thinking skills or relationship skills or whatever you want to call it are super important, and I do think we can get better at it. Because testing is not an isolated occurrence. Testing is not something that happens off in a corner that doesn't impact anyone else and no one else should care about. To me, testing only really has value if you communicate what you do and what the results are to the rest of the team and to the stakeholders. And in order to be able to do that, you need to be a good communicator. You need to have good diplomatic skills. You need to be able to ask questions. And to me, those are the skills I talk about when I talk about soft skills. And I see it more as behavioral skills. What do you think? Can soft skills improve?
Yeah.
How? How do you improve your own soft skills or training? There's absolutely explicit training on soft skills.
Conscious reflection on what you're doing and working on.
Conscious reflection on what you're doing and working on. Other suggestions?
Find the role model and try to copy the behavior.
Find a role model. And a lot of it is self-awareness. Reflecting on, like you were saying, how other people perceive you and what you say, and how you respond to other people communicating with you. I was reading an article. I do read a lot of articles, and I read a lot of psychology. And Dr. Epstein is at the University of California in San Diego. And he believes that there are 7 essential skills for a happy love life, a long-term loving relationship. And I find that those apply really well to testing too. The first one is communication. You need to be able to listen and to share your thoughts and your feelings and to refrain from criticizing, but at the same time encourage your partner to share his or her feelings. So if you replace partner with anyone else on the team, I think that's pretty appropriate. We sometimes deny a little bit that there's a lot of emotion involved in everything we do, and that includes our work and it includes software development. So communication skills are crucially important, and to be able to acknowledge that there are feelings involved as well, both in ourselves and the people we're talking to, I think is part of being smart about testing. Second one is conflict resolution. Has anyone ever gotten anywhere close to being in a conflict with someone on a project? Maybe with a developer potentially? Or a tester if you're a developer? Conflict resolution techniques that Dr. Epstein talks about include staying focused on the topic, staying focused on the present, and to be ready to forgive or apologize, and knowing when to take a break. And to me, that is really important when you're working on a team. You work close together, sometimes there's a lot of pressure, the deadline is coming up, things can get a little bit heated. Sometimes you just need to take a break. You also need to look at yourself and understanding, why am I arguing about this right now? Is it because the bug is important or because I'm tired? The third one is knowledge of a partner. So you need to understand who you're working with. What do they like? What don't they like? Because you're really supposed to, with testing, we're trying to address some of the stakeholder needs. So we need to know what our stakeholders actually do need. So knowledge of partner is basically, to me, knowledge of the team and the stakeholders. Next is life skills. And what Dr. Epstein means by life skills is planning for emergencies, actually. Are you prepared to handle emergencies? you know that things are going to get rough on the project at some point, and the stakeholders are relying on you. Are you prepared? Are you set up to handle that when it happens? Number 5 is self-management. And by self-management, it doesn't mean the same thing as life skills, but it means being able to take inventory of your own strengths and weaknesses. So self-management is a little bit like self-awareness and knowing yourself. And then there's stress management. Some people talk about, especially when you're recruiting or interviewing, is how do you behave under stress? Can you manage stress? Those are not really questions I like, because I think you should not necessarily be able to handle stress, but to avoid it and sort of manage it. How do you even prevent getting there? Have you ever been stressed at work? How do you manage stress? I think it is inevitable. Whether you like it or not, there are going to be stressful times. And I think you need to have an approach for how you're going to deal with that, how you're going to try to prevent it, or deal with it when it happens, so it doesn't go out over yourself, your team, or the product you're developing. So I left the header as soft skills. I might change this going forward. But whenever we call it, these are skills that I think are really important for testers to be smart.
Can you say there were 7 of them?
I was wondering if someone was going to ask. Number 6 is about sex and romance. And I couldn't quite tweak that one to fit. It's about understanding your partner's needs on a more physical level. I tried. Couldn't make it work. For the next version, though, even though it's in small print, if you want to know about number 6, there I do have the link, and I'll be happy to share that one.
What about a parent sharing a keyboard?
No. The way he wrote number 6, it can't really be tweaked or worked into anything. It was very explicit. In general, though, psychology is a great resource for learning things that will help you improve as a tester. Another thing that I think is really important to be a smart tester is to understand why we test. Why do you test on your projects? Sorry?
Software will break.
So software will break?
No,
Okay.
confidence.
Confidence? Sorry?
To prove that your software is not stable to go live.
To prove that it can go live?
That your software is enough stable to
Stable
go
enough
live.
to go live? Okay.
Quality.
Quality? So what is quality?
Quality is that it does what it's supposed to do for the end user with as few issues as possible.
So you test either to break it, to test to show that it's stable enough to be released, to test that it fulfills requirements, expectations.
That's what it does, what it's supposed to do.
That's what it's supposed to do,
To give feedback?
to give feedback.
Test that you, so when you make a change, you're confident that you haven't broken anything else.
It's confidence.
Confidence again that you haven't broken something that was working before. Okay, any other reasons with any of you test?
I have nothing else to do.
Nothing else? Every time I ask that question, I'm really always hoping someone's going to say because it's fun. It hasn't happened yet, but one of these days. So I think that the answers you're given are actually fundamentally quite different. Finding ways in which it breaks, showing that it's stable, providing information and feedback, confidence and quality. And the reasons why we test, I think, will very much impact how we test. So if we're on the same project and we have different objectives with the testing, are we going to be aligned and do the same things? I'm not necessarily saying that we all need to agree, but I think we need to talk about it and talk about, so why are we testing on this project? Because the reasons are not the same. Sometimes it's really important that the product is stable. Sometimes it's really important that it looks glossy. We need to find just visual defects. Sometimes it's about confidence. Sometimes it's really information that's the most important thing, feedback. And I think it does vary. And even the same product you might not have exactly the same objectives every time you test it. So smarter testing, to me, starts with talking about why we test. And one reason I think we test is to add value. And earlier today, Lisa and Janet talked about finding ways you can add value to your team. I thought that was a good quote because I really believe that testing should add value. So I tweeted that as a quote, which led to about 50 follow-up tweets by now. People have very different opinions on what value means, and I should have known that. How we use words is really, really important to think about. We're all aware of that quality is subjective. Quality means different things to different people. I hadn't really thought about how differently people view the word value. And value is, of course, also very, very much subjective. So when I go and say, testing should have value, that will create a very different response in different people. So that was a good reminder. I thank the Twitter sphere for that. So if you just all maybe for now agree on that value is something positive that makes life better and unicorns and fluffy pink clouds, then I do believe that testing should and can add value. And basically, I think everything that we do on a team, on a project, regardless of what our formal role is, if we're not adding value, why are we doing it? What's the purpose of the activity if it doesn't add value to the team? I don't see any value in measuring value, though. How can you measure value? I like being happy. I would say that I actually strive actively every day to be happy. I know when I'm more happy and when I'm less happy, but I don't measure happy. I'm not on a Christin index 8.95 on the happiness scale today. I just know that I'm feeling good. And to me, value kind of works the same way. I would distinguish between low value and high value, but I don't associate it with a number. So what do you think? Does testing add value always? Always. Or what is testing that doesn't add value?
I struggle with this all the time that, I'm a bug magnet. I can always find bugs in something. But a lot of the bugs I'm finding, if the users even ran across them, they probably wouldn't even care. And they would probably rather we spend our time on new features that they're desperate to have rather than fixing a lot of bugs they don't care about. So it's a really interesting balance.
So if sometimes you find bugs that are maybe not the most important bugs at that point in time, so is that adding value? I would say it's still adding value, but there's something else you could do that would add more value. But it doesn't make the first thing worthless, right?
Right, that's true.
I think we talked about this a lot in the last presentation about tests that fail intermittently might actually cost more than they're worth.
Sometimes the cost of testing is higher than the value it adds. Absolutely. So value itself is not the same thing as money or cost saving, but I think that goes back to the good enough and when do we stop testing. If the cost is higher than the benefits of the value add, we probably shouldn't do it, right?
But how is that decision made?
How is it made and who makes that decision? What does anyone need to be able to make that decision? How can you decide if we're supposed to continue testing? Are we done? Is it still adding value? Let's say you're a stakeholder and you're sitting in your office 5 floors above the test team. You've never seen any one of them. You don't know what they're called. You don't know what they do. Can you make that decision? No, probably, of course you can. You can always make a decision. You probably, sorry?
You shouldn't, but you will.
You shouldn't, but you will. You might even be forced to. And you're probably not going to like doing it. To be able to make that decision, what you need is the knowledge and the information that we as good, smart testers communicate, right? And sometimes it's hard to know. And sometimes, because we're talking about things that are hard to measure, you're not necessarily going to know in advance if something is going to be worth the effort or not. Sometimes it's trial and error. Not everything we do is always going to be perfect. I see testing as a service to stakeholders primarily, about providing feedback and information. We learn about the application under test when we're testing. Then we're supposed to communicate what we learn back to the stakeholders to enable them to make informed decisions. So inform them about risks. That's my view on testing, and this is where we come back to my views, my opinions. They're not the ultimate truth. Everyone is free to disagree and to do so loudly. But that's what I think we do as testers, or should do. We inform stakeholders about product risks. When I talk about product risks, I mean any risk that the product is going to fail to meet any expectations, whether it's set by legislation, users, business requirements, just any expectations that are reasonable and are put on the software. So understanding why we test and agreeing on what the objectives of testing are, that's really the core of it. But then it's about learning and communicating information that we gain to the stakeholders. Being smart in a high-paced and continuously changing environment can be quite challenging, though. So it's easy to end up being reactive rather than being proactive. So at PQA, we try to develop a little framework to help testers be smarter and to test smarter. And we're probably not the best at coming up with clever names, so we call it the 5 A's. Assess, align, advise, accelerate, and apply. So, first of all, a disclaimer. When I call this a framework, this is not a checklist of 5 things you always do, and that's the one way of testing. A framework to me is a suggestion of things that might be useful, and you should look at them, adapt them to your own context, and use what you like. So, I think you should start by always assessing the context and what the needs of the project and the stakeholders are. You take what you learn of the context to align the level of formality in terms of approach and documentation with the needs of the environment, the project, and the stakeholders. Once you have that in place, you can provide advice on what you believe is the best test approach for this project. Given your test approach, you can try to save time and accelerate by having templates, frameworks, anything that can make your life a little bit easier. And then, of course, you shouldn't forget to actually apply it and do it. So nothing of what I'm going to talk about is, there are no revolutionary ideas, probably not actually anything new either. Things you already know about, just packaged slightly differently together. Hopefully trying in an attempt to try to help you get going faster in projects. Sometimes all you need is to articulate something, to provide new guidelines. And this framework also doesn't talk about whether you're doing manual testing or automated testing. This is on a higher level to just help you step through what you can do and think about when you're defining your approach. So, starting with assess. Assess means evaluating expectations of quality. We talked about why we test and that quality is subjective. And what I like to do is to have a discussion around quality criteria. Have you ever asked a manager, what do you want us to focus on when we test? What do they usually answer?
Everything.
Everything. Always want you to test everything, right? But you can't. So what should you focus on? What's more important than something else? And I find talking about quality criteria to be very, very helpful. And these are just a couple of examples that I've taken from James Strox's heuristic test strategy model. So when you just talk to your stakeholders, what's most important to them? Is it functionality? That the product provides the required functions? Is it usability? As in, is the product easy to use? Is it performance? So how well does the product perform under load? Or is it maybe security? How well does the product handle unauthorized use? Or maybe it's compatibility. How well does the product work on the different platforms? Could it be reliability? How well does it handle failures? Or maybe scalability. does the product scale up well? And by talking about explicit quality criteria, you can ask stakeholders to prioritize. If I give you a list of 10 things, can you rank them from 1 to 10, from the most important one to the least important one to you? And then I have a priority list of what they care about the most that I can use to guide my testing. And that's what I use as my input to the next step, which is align. What I mean by align is aligning the level of formality of the testing with the project's needs for reproducibility and traceability. How much testing do you really need on your projects? Is there a good answer? How much testing do you need? How much documentation do you need? As much as I can? Does everyone agree with that? You should have as much.
You need, please.
See, I like her. She's smart. As much documentation as you can get, or can write, or as much documentation as you need. How much documentation do you create on your projects?
As little as I can get away with.
As little as I can get away with. That's a good answer. I like that one too. What decides how much documentation you create, apart from how much you can get away with?
Business requirements.
Business requirements.
Who's coming after you?
Who's coming after you? Yeah, sometimes scary people come after you. Sorry? Project?
Communication channels.
Communication channels. Has anyone ever been stuck with a project methodology that says, thou shall have this and this and that? They tend to be still out there and not always for good reasons. Sometimes there are good reasons. But the amount of documentation you create should really be based on what you need. If you're not going to use a certain artifact, why would you create it? If someone asks for it, ask them why they need it. Communicate with them. Is there another way you can provide the information? Or is there really a valid reason why they want that artifact created? So aligning is about recognizing how formal the project is, the environment, and the industry. Because it does vary. And it allows you to align an appropriate level of documentation to the project's needs. So I always prefer, of course, to adapt as lean an approach as possible when I can. And sometimes, when you're in a regulated industry, you need to provide a little bit more. But to me, the amount of artifacts and how detailed actual artifacts are depends on primarily industry, environment, and the objectives of testing. And if there's something then being asked to create that I don't see the need for or that I'm not going to use, I will of course ask the question, why should I create this? So we usually use or talk about 3 different levels of documentation, and this is not like 3 different boxes where you have to pick one, but it's just to make the discussion a little bit easier, and of course the borders are very vague and there's everything in between. But things that matter are, of course, are there regulatory requirements in the industry? Do you have to comply with certain standards that actually dictate that you have to create certain documents? Are you going to be audited, internally or externally? Are you relying heavily on written communication instead of oral communication? Especially some distributed teams, they completely rely on things being written down to communicate, and that changes things. I might not think that I need a certain test artifact for my sake, but maybe some other team members that are in a different office in a different time zone do need that. Do we expect to rerun tests, or is this a one-off? So since testing is so much about communication, or communicating information to stakeholders, how much we document should really be aligned with how and how much we communicate with stakeholders, including our team members. So we like to talk about lean, comprehensive, and compliant. Since lean is sort of already a word in use, it's maybe not the best one for our highest level, but by lean we mean that we only create the artifacts that are needed to support testing. So we prioritize execution over redundant artifact creation, but we will of course create what we need to do our daily job as testers. And this typically fits projects where the time to market is high priority, functional and business requirements are not necessarily well documented, and the expected reuse of test artifacts is quite low. Comprehensive is trying to strike a balance between test execution and test documentation. Some projects require a more formal communication around test planning, and there might be business need for test tracking that requires you to create more artifacts. Compliant is the most formal level of documentation. That's where you actually need, or someone requires you to show test coverage, traceability, reproducibility. And this is typically only for projects that are regulated. We are going to get audited and there are health and safety requirements. And I'd like to do this by setting up a table. So for each of the 3 different documentation levels, I can list different types of artifacts. And these are just examples, so don't go back and say, Christine said that you have to have a product risk matrix and compliant projects. But I'm a visual person. I like structure and order, so tables really help me think. What I like to do is to, again, list all the different artifacts that I could create. And then think about, in these different types of environments and these different needs for documentation, what would I create and what do I think I need? And I like to think in terms of optional, recommended, and mandatory. And for example, I really like making mind maps for test plans. Again, because it works for me, I like having the visual overview. And I think you should always have a mind map. Easy to create, easy to communicate, you can work collaboratively on it. It's much easier to get feedback than if you have a 50-page document. So I think that test plan, mind maps are definitely mandatory if you're lean or comprehensive. If you're in a compliant industry, no one's going to look at your mind map of the people that are auditing you, but I would still recommend creating the mind map. Formal test plans. I don't think you need them on the lean level. Could be good on comprehensive, and it's probably mandatory in a compliant environment. So this is a little bit like a cheat sheet of how to pick your documentation level. Again, just 4 examples of different test artifacts. This is not the final truth, just a guideline. Yes?
How do you make sure that your test artifacts are up to date as things change over time? Are you going to get into that, or?
How do you make sure your test artifacts are up to date?
Yeah, I mean, like for instance, your mind map. They're great for visual things, but you look at it 1 year later, I guess it's probably out of date by that time, unless you're somehow maintaining it.
So the question is how to maintain test artifacts, and I think that's another reason for going lean and documenting less, is because the more documentation you create, the more of a maintenance headache you create. And I think Bob said something about rather fewer test scripts that are 100% running well. I can't remember how it was phrased, but less is more basically. Fewer things that are functioning than more things that are not up to date, and that applies to test document as well. So you should only ever create a 50-page test plan or test strategy if you have someone who owns it and who's responsible for updating it. That comes back to the whole needs thing. If you're using it, it's automatically going to stay up to date. If you're not using it, you should throw it out.
I think a lot of people believe that a regulated industry and auditors mean that you have to have very sort of formal documentation and matrices and things. But I work in a financial services company, and our auditors, after we explain to them that we have this documentation on our wiki, which is easy to update, and we have this documentation as executable tests in the form of a fitness test that were readable by humans as well as always up to date because it had to pass every day. They were perfectly happy to accept that to meet the requirements for traceability and documentation, and so if you explain it to them, it doesn't, just because it's regulated doesn't mean
No,
that they don't understand.
Don't make assumptions on what people need.
Right.
Just because, like you're saying, it's regulated doesn't mean that they necessarily want a 50-page test plan. And just because they're a small digital agency that build web pages in 2 days doesn't mean they don't want it. So it's about communicating and asking questions. And I actually worked for Siemens Technologies 5 years ago and talked to them about the testing they do on X-ray machines. which is kind of important. You sort of want it to work and be able to prove that, yes, they're regulated, and they did exploratory testing. They did session-based testing for all their testing, and that was fine. They had asked, they had shown what they were producing in terms of artifacts, and the auditor had no complaints. So it's perfectly doable if you ask, what do you need? And if you tell me you need a 50-page test plan, I'll ask why, and maybe I actually do need it, and trust me, I will create it. As long as I think there's a good reason for it, we're good. So again, this is not the truth. This is just a way of thinking about it that I find to be quite helpful. Step number 3, advice. I like the idea in general about testing, providing information, and also providing advice rather than telling people necessarily this is the way we have to do it. Because I don't always know everything on a project, and I need to listen to other people and other roles to understand what are their objectives. Do they align with our test objectives? Are we trying to achieve the same thing? So I like to call this advice, saying that we're giving advice on what we think the best test approach is for the project. Of course, taking time and budget constraints into account. And what defines the approach is, of course, understanding what quality means to all the stakeholders on this project and understanding the context. How often do you use different test approaches on projects? How often do you change your approach? Constantly. Good. Why? Because you keep learning. You're a very good example though. I have occasionally seen projects where people do things the same way over and over again for no better reason that it did work last time, right? And it's a bit of a balance too. I'm also a strong believer in if it works, don't fix it. But if you don't try something else, you're never going to know if there's a better way of doing it. So I think you have to strike a balance. I don't believe that you can just go on every project, just throw everything out, start from scratch, don't use any of the lessons you learn. But you should at least look at what you're doing and try to understand why you're doing it. And I think understanding what quality means and understanding your context are the two most important aspects. Now your test approach should of course talk about what test levels are you going to use, what test types, what techniques, how are you going to do things. And you can do that without writing all those pages of documentation. There are different ways of doing it. And some of it does come back to tools. There are some really good collaborative tools you can use, especially for mind maps. And finding ways in which you can share the information and communicate is really important. Like Andrew talked about, how do you maintain documents or how do you make sure they're up to date? I'm a big fan of sticky notes. I love using sticky notes for stuff. That works really well for me. Tends to be a bit of a problem when I'm traveling all the time and working with other people. Because they're in my office, on my wall, and they're not going with me. So you have to sometimes look at other ways, and if I can't maintain it, then it's not working. If it doesn't happen by itself, if I have to force it, it's probably not the right way to do it. Okay, so we've decided that we understand what quality is. We know how much documentation we need. We know how we're going to test. How can we test faster? How can you save time on your projects when you're testing? There's no time to be saved. You're as efficient as you could possibly be. Do you ever use templates for anything?
Work share.
Work share?
There's other people that can do work sometimes faster or might already be doing parts of it.
You can distribute some of the work, share the workload. You can use templates.
Create your own library of tools.
Create your own library of tools.
Reuse of existing materials.
Reuse existing material.
Well, just to give a specific example, with testing our API, I was always just cutting and pasting curl commands. I had a wiki page of curl commands. And then we started using Postman, which is just a tool that helps you create the curl commands for you. And it just saves a lot of time. It keeps you from making copy-paste mistakes and things like that.
Having a repository of simple things like commands or certain SQL queries just useful links to environments, shell script commands we're just building. There's all sorts of stuff you can do to prevent reinventing the wheel all the time. To me, Accelerate is about using heuristics. There's a lot of good bug taxonomies that you can use, having templates, having frameworks. There's sometimes this drive we have to improve and get better. It does make us do some redundant work and waste a bit of time. And to some extent, it's also okay to waste time, but it's again, finding the balance. So I think it's important to look at the resources we have available and think about how can we use those efficiently. And also to look at what other people are doing and how can I use that. And that's why we go to conferences, that's why we go to the user group meetups, that's why we talk to people or read about psychology. See, what are other people using that could be good for me as well? Another thing that I often use that kind of falls in between Advise and Accelerate is a different kind of table. I do think that all testing should be risk-driven. And if you just, to simplify, talk about low, high, and medium risk, you can decide in advance roughly how are you going to test for different types of risk. So to me, something is high risk should always be tested exploratory. Because exploratory testing is a great way to find critical bugs fast. Maybe for high-risk areas, you also want to have some kind of automation in place. And maybe you want scripted manual tests as well. Maybe for something that's low risk, scripted, manual, or automated testing is optional. And now I put exploratory testing as recommended only too. Maybe you shouldn't even test it if it's low risk, depending on how much time you have available and what other things there are to work on. And the reason for doing something like this is to have sort of a quick way, when you're under pressure in a project and time is running short, and you're trying to decide how to approach something. This is not always the right answer, but it can help you give ideas for how you should approach something to, again, align how we work on the project. That only leaves the fun step, applying it. Sometimes you also get very caught up in all these fancy ideas and they never sort of leave the drawing board. Applying is really just about taking your approach and your accelerators and do it. And it's of course iterative. You test, you analyze your test results, you communicate your test results, you see how it worked out, you adapt, and you do again. So it doesn't really ever stop, right? It still has to be a cycle, even though the way I talk about it, it sounds like it's a very waterfall-like process. So just to summarize this 5A framework, it starts by assessing, which to me means defining what quality means on the project. Next, we understand the context, understand what the needs of the project and stakeholders are. Then we determine what approach to use. We look at what we can reuse, what kind of templates and frameworks we can implement to get going faster and to help save us time. And then we just do it. As you might have guessed, I use Twitter quite a bit, and I came across a really good quote yesterday. The best thing is to learn from others and use your brain when applying those lessons in your own context. So hopefully you've gotten something out of what I've been talking about today. I hope you will take it home with you, think about it, and apply the bits and pieces that work for you in your context. I have no idea who this person is, but check her out. She might actually have other smart things to say as well. Any questions or comments so far? You're doing pretty good for 4 in the afternoon. Sorry. Still digesting my information. That's a good answer. Let's just leave it at that. I do like talking about testing. That's basically all I do all the time. So feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, Twitter, via mail. You can actually also call me. That's a perfectly okay way to communicate. Or come visit. Our office is down on Hastings and Granville. And I seriously do like talking about testing. And I think that's one of the most important things. It's about discussing our approaches and throwing ideas around and bouncing ideas off each other to try to work together to improve our own testing on our projects and make it smarter, but also to make testing smarter as a profession and to promote testing and show that it does add value, no matter how you respond to the word value itself. And I'm going to be here for quite a while longer today, so feel free to come up and talk to me later or on the panel. Thank you very much.